Welcome to 10-Minute University Noontime Chat. In case you're not familiar with 10-Minute University, it is the trademark of short classes, videos, and handouts that provide essential gardening information for you, the home gardener, or the trademark, and Clackamas County Master Gardeners develop and manage the program. Today's class is one of our 2021 series of webinars. To learn more about future classes and to access our free library of fantastic handouts and videos, please visit cmastergardeners.org. We're also on Facebook as 10-Minute University. We have limited time together today. I want to make sure you're familiar with all that 10-Minute University offers. In handouts, here's just a short list of the topics that we have. And in videos, here are some examples of what we offer. And these videos range from short ones of 3 to 5 minutes to longer ones of 20 minutes or so. My goal for you today is at the end of the class, you're going to know how to use major pruning cuts. You know how timing affects plants' response to pruning cuts, and you learn how to shape and prune 3 types of plants. So let's first look at the 2 types of pruning cuts. Heading cuts remove a portion of a branch, generally to an outward-facing bud. And thinning cuts remove it from the point of origin. And that's another way to say take off the whole thing. Now, how a plant responds to the heading versus thinning cuts is quite different. And that's the result of auxin, which is a group of growth hormone that concentrates at the tip of a branch to ensure dominance of the tip and rapid growth of it and suppress growth down below. Now, in a vertical branch, when you look at the picture on the right half, auxin's effect is the strongest, and the effect subsides as the branch gets bent over and moved toward a horizontal position. So when we make cuts of small branches, we want to cut at an angle away from the bud that's facing toward the outside. Now, first look, the 2 illustrations on the outside seem about the same. But the correct one is to make sure the cut is roughly 1/4 inch above the bud, as opposed to flush, as is shown in the left one. When we cut a large branch, and by that I mean 1.5 inch or larger in diameter, make sure it's cut in 3 steps. So you begin with an undercut where it's marked A, usually about 6 inches away from the trunk, and then remove the weight by making a cut where it's labeled B, and finally finish off by making the cut labeled C. And please notice C is cut flush to the collar and not the branch, or not the trunk. So let's take a closer look at the collar. So collar is an area that is swollen, as shown in this example. And it is the place where the tree or the plant keeps a reserve of chemicals, and their job is to slow the spread of decay. And now you understand why it is important for us to keep the collar when we prune a tree. And the correct place to make the cut would be the line that's marked yes, and no would have cut into the collar and leaving a festering wound that may not heal and opening up the tree to pathogen and other problems. Now, collar sometimes can be difficult to spot in a tree. In this example, when you look at the picture on the left half, it's pretty easy to see the swollen area. I'll give you a little shortcut. First, begin with the branch bark ridge. See the line over there marked by pointed to with the blue line. And that's formed because the bark of the trunk is pushed against the bark of the stem as they grow together. So you move away toward the stem from the bark ridge and then look for an area that looks somewhat different from the rest of the plant. The collar here looks swollen, but in some other trees, it may look really wrinkled. At any rate, it takes a great deal of practice in order to be able to spot it. So now we've talked about the major cuts. Let's talk about how timing affects the plant's response to pruning. So when we prune in the winter, when the plant is dormant, as soon as it comes out of dormancy, it will respond to the pruning by having very vigorous growth. And often, especially harsh cuts made in the winter will result in many upright vertical shoots that commonly are called water spouts. This is a problem because we don't want water sprouts and they need to be removed. So just be aware, if you prune in the winter, the plant will respond accordingly and you'll have to do additional management. And in addition, pruning creates wounds in a tree or a shrub. And in the winter, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where the climate is wet, those wounds may take longer to dry out. Now, summer pruning is an alternative. The different effect of pruning in the summer is we're removing the foliage, which is used for photosynthesis. So in essence, we're putting the plant on a diet. And if we do too much reduction during the summer of the foliage, we're likely to weaken the tree. However, for those plants that tend to get sickly and easily infected by pathogens, summer will be a good time to prune because the wound will dry out quickly. And it probably does not need to be said, if we're pruning flowering trees and shrubs, it's a good idea to prune after the flowering is done. And in general, the spring bloomers, they should be pruned the previous summer. And the summer bloomers, they should be pruned in late winter of the current year. So here are some general do's and don'ts. The one thing that gardeners need to remember is whenever we see any part of the plant that's dead, diseased, or damaged, remove it. Because these are useless or potentially doing harm to the plant, and they should not stay there longer than that we can allow them to. Now, there are some situations where we do not want to prune because pruning is creating a stress on the plant. And we don't want to confound the stress when the weather is extremely cold or hot, or when the plant is just being put into the ground or being transplanted, or in early spring when trees are just coming out of dormancy and beginning to grow. A group of plants, here are examples of trees that are heavy bleeders, meaning that they lose sap. It's very unsightly. However, experts do not agree on how much damage it is to a tree. But if you have birch, cherry, maple, plum, smoke tree, hornbeam, it's a good idea to not make major cuts in the early spring, just when they first come out of dormancy and begin vigorous growth. And a couple other don'ts. In late summer, early fall, before the plant goes into dormancy, not a good idea, because pruning stimulates growth, and that growth will not have much time to become hardened before winter comes. And finally, we've mentioned earlier, do not prune off the flowers if we want to get the most enjoyment. So let's move on to look at how to shape and prune 3 groups of plants. But I think in general, it's important for gardeners to remember, before we get into cutting, removing any parts of a tree or a shrub, we should have a very clear reason for why we're doing this. Now, there are some legitimate reasons for pruning. It could be for the beauty of the plant. Perhaps we want to accentuate the natural form. Perhaps we want to create unnatural forms or shapes for our own amusement. It could be for the health of the plant. We talked about the 3 Ds, dead, diseased, and damaged. They should be removed as soon as we notice. But we seldom hear about using pruning as a way to create a strong framework and proper branch angles. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that. And the structure in the strong framework and the branch angle in the tree, and often larger shrubs, are quite important to the health and longevity of the plant. And finally, pruning could be used as a tool for us to get more flowers, bigger flowers, and the same with the fruits. Before we prune, we should definitely have a good idea of how our plant is supposed to look like and use that as a baseline. And secondly, when we're looking at a tree, and sometimes the larger shrubs, it's important to think about what is the desirable framework which will allow this plant to grow strong. If we look at the tree from the side, we should see the branches, their points of attachment to the trunk are spaced vertically, ideally 8 to 24 inches apart. And if we look at the tree from the top, we should see those branches attached to the trunk, radiating around it like spokes of a wheel. Now, both of these elements are important. The 360-degree coverage around the trunk, as well as the vertical distance, together minimize the competition and ensures a stronger framework to support a long-living plant. I also mentioned that the angle of attachment of branches are very important. Now, here's just an illustration to show when we have an angle of attachment that is 45 to 60 degrees, which is ideal, like in the illustration on the left, we have strong bonding of the wood, the cambium wood, growing together. When we have 2 branches come together and form a narrow angle, the narrow angle creates a problem for us, and that's called inclusion. Now, inclusion is, you see that it says bark inclusion. Inclusion is as the branch grows, the bark in that narrow crotch continues to grow, and it becomes part of it becomes compressed and included in the cambium wood. So that becomes a problem because the attachment is very weak. And I'll show you what I mean here. So this is a tree in my neighborhood. When you look at the left half, the picture was taken last fall. When I noticed, see how the angle of attachment are super, super narrow? For example, right here and here, these two branches are practically grown together, so there's hardly any angle in between. And after the ice storm a couple weeks ago, I went out and checked on this tree again. And here we can see the bark inclusion. See all that dark material, which looks really different from the cambium wood. And that is the bark, which kept the branches from forming a very strong bond. And so there's no surprise that branch broke off. So let's say you have a tree that is a pretty good size, similar to the illustration on the left-hand side. And the major problem here, let's say, is it's supposed to be a single leader form with the central leader being dominant and nothing or very little to compete with it from the side. But now we have overlooked doing anything to this tree for years, and a couple of the side branches have grown pretty big, not about the same size as the central leader, and now they're competing. So what happened in this situation is the central leader will become weakened because of the competition from the side branches, and perhaps we don't want that. That's not how the tree is supposed to be, and we want it to grow healthier as single leader form. So here we can practice something called a reduction cut. And the reduction cut would be removing the upper roughly 2/3 in the illustration here of those side branches, following the dotted line that says shorten now. So if we remove those, you're going to end up with the center having full access to sunlight and good air circulation, and the side branches would become essentially fair, but not much of a threat. So if you look at the right half, that illustration, you can see how the reduction cut is made. So before pruning, we have the side branch and then another branch which forms a third branch off of it. If we're going to practice reduction cut, we could cut the branch going that's more upright, where it says first cut. Now we end up with a much shorter branch that is outward facing and not competing with the center anymore. Now this works generally when the branch that's remaining after the cut is at least half the size in diameter of the one we remove. I'll give you a moment to think about it. Otherwise, the result will not be very successful. It will look odd. The branch that remains would have a long time to catch up in growth and look appropriate. But that's an option. And here is an example of a tree that perhaps we would want to use reduction cut And that's because of the recent storm damage. You can see a large branch split off here that we will probably make a cut outside the collar to the trunk and remove it because this just cannot be salvaged. Now look at this major branch moving to the upper left corner. There is a major branch broke off, and we don't like having such a large open wound here because obviously there is no collar left. So we might consider practicing reduction cut right here. Let me see. Let me get a marker here. Okay, we might do a reduction cut right here, which will then allow us to use the side branch as something that we keep and open up this area of the tree and see if it could restore itself over time. All right, moving on. So when we have deciduous and broadleaf evergreen trees, usually we want the pruning to support and accentuate the natural form and beauty. And really much of that pruning work is in balancing the trunk with the foliage. And there is not any real right answer in terms of how much foliage per trunk. It's more your sense of what looks good. But I had just mentioned in young trees, it's important for us to use pruning as a way to make sure that it has a healthy framework and strong branch angles. And in mature trees, it's important for us to look for crossing branches because they could rub against each other and create injury or damage down the road. And also we want to maintain the foliage or the canopy in a way that in the middle of the day during the summer, if we are under this plant, that we can see dappled sunlight going through. And the reason why that's important is because if we have totally dark centers, leaves simply either are not going to grow or are not going to look good. All right, so this gardener chooses to showcase the beautiful foliage in this small tree. And this gardener chooses to showcase the trunk structure in this tree. So again, neither is right or wrong, it's just your sense of aesthetics. And it's important to practice our sense of what looks good. So when you look at this tree, does it look good to you? Or does it bother you because it doesn't look quite as uniform as you might like it? So just keeping up the practice of observing and hone your skills. Now, when we're looking at weeping form of a tree or shrub, those same principles of distance, vertical distance in the branch spacing, the branch angle, 45 to 60 degrees, where it comes into the trunk. And there's a third thing. What is it? Well, can't think of it. So these things are important. Let me look at my note and see if I can find it. So the branch angle, the spacing, the branch angle, both are very important. And and the ratio of the foliage with which would allow with the branches, which would allow dappled light to go through. So these three principles still apply, but there's a big difference when it comes to a weeping form. In general, the twist and turning branches is valued. However, in the upright form, we usually want the branches to grow toward the outside. While in the weeping form, we often will cut to an inward facing bud, so the branch will go toward the inside. And in case you're interested, there is a 10-minute university pruning video demonstrating how to prune a Japanese maple. It's only 5 minutes, and you can find it on our website. All right, now let's look at conifers. Conifers as a group need very little pruning. In fact, they should generally be left alone. However, if you know where to cut, you could do some pruning in order to improve the form and health. And it's also possible to slow growth somewhat. So with spruce, Douglas-Fir, and fir, they have buds along the green stem. So anywhere that's green, you may cut into and you're going to get new growth. And really the best time to make these cuts is late winter, because the growth will come out in the spring. And so shortly after you make those cuts, that the new growth would hide where you have made the the removal. One thing to watch out for in these trees is they're strongest if they have a single leader. However, they do have a tendency to have a second, even a third leader develop when you're not looking. So do try to pay attention. And when you notice, prune it back to maintain that single leader form, which will give you the strongest structure. Now, yews are very forgiving. You can cut into practically anywhere along the branch or the tip, and you're going to get new growth. And that's probably why they're used for topiary, hedges, etc. Pines grow only a single flush of new growth called candles, looking like kind of candles in this picture. And they usually come out in spring, usually mid to late spring. So after that flush of growth of candles, they stop growing. So the time to prune is when the candles have just formed, generally in they are a couple inches long. If you want a more compact growth, you can shorten the candles by a third, a half. It won't hurt them. Let's say your pine, you have a small pine tree, and you really don't want it to get bigger. You can allow the candles to grow, but when they're still pliable, remove the entire candle. And that's going to keep your small pine tree or shrub at the same size. And the final group of evergreens are the plants that are often used for hedges. Now, they have new growth in the tip and in random growth points along the green areas. So anywhere that you see green, you may cut into and you will see new growth, but not into old wood. And it's probably best to prune them when they are pushing new growth. So again, you don't end up with a cut that looks quite unsightly. All right, so we have a final group of plants, and they are the ornamental shrubs. Here are some general strategies. I know this photo, this is another picture of a shrub in my neighborhood. Doesn't it look just daunting? It looks like a huge mess. And how would you prune this and open it up? Well, it's actually pretty simple. If we want to open up the congestion, we have to use thinning cuts. Remember, because thinning cuts will remove a branch from its point of origin and open up the plant, while heading cuts will make the plant bushier. And what we want to do is begin with the biggest cut. And to find the biggest cuts, we have to go low, as close to the ground as we can get to. So in this messy looking shrub here, you get out your loppers or your saw, you get on the ground and reach into the center and look for up to 1/3 of the thickest, oldest looking branches, remove them at the ground level, pull them out, and after that, this thing is going to look so different. And remember, there is a rule of 1/3 pruning budget, which is there for us to not remove too much and damage the plant. So after you remove those oldest branches, you may do a little bit more of cosmetic cuts. For example, some errant branch has become, a foot higher than the rest. You can bring it back. But otherwise, just removing the oldest branches, up to 1/3 of them, is going to do the bulk of the work you want. Roses. Roses bloom on Curranier wood. So the picture in the left is a hybrid tea rose. So what we want to do is the same thing as I talked about with the non-flowering shrub, and that is you go to the ground, look for the oldest branches, remove up to 1/3 of them, and then with the remaining branches, you cut to an outside bud. So you can have a good form that is open to the sunlight and a good air circulation in the center. For the hybrid tea and grandiflora roses, the bigger flowering ones, you can cut them to 12 to 18 inches above ground. And for the floribunda roses, these are the ones with large trusses of flowers. You can cut them to 24 to 30 inches, 36 inches above ground. Now, for climbing rose, the strategy is a little different. So look at the picture on the right-hand side. So some of the climbing roses, the larger roses, are once blooming, and some are repeat bloomers. So if your large rose only blooms once a year, allow it to bloom and then do the pruning. But if your large rose bloom twice or more, then you want to do the pruning in late winter. And these roses should be supported like this illustration. So the main canes are the thicker stems that come from the ground. These main canes should be supported on some sort of structure, and it's best if they are kept kind of close to a horizontal orientation. Remember we talked earlier about auxin, the growth hormone? In this instance, we want our main canes in roses to be horizontal so that auxin cannot do that much in suppressing growth, which will then give us a lot more side shoots and a lot more flowers. So with the repeat bloomers, prune late winter. With once bloomers, prune after blooming. But you're only really pruning the small flowering stems coming off of the main canes. And you only remove the main canes if there are too many of them that you're not able to support using your available structure. And in that instance, you may remove the oldest or the least productive ones. hydrangeas, some hydrangeas bloom on the growths that come this year, such as these, the paniculatas that have panicle-shaped flowers and the arborescens. So they should be pruned in late winter, early spring, and then the new growth in response to the pruning will give us flowers later in the season. And by the way, we also have a short video demonstrating how to prune hydrangea. Now, other types of hydrangeas, like the big leaf ones and the oak leaf ones, they bloom on the wood that developed last year. So they should be pruned right after flowering, and only the stems that have bloomed need to be pruned. Lilacs. Lilacs are really enjoyable if we can see the flowers and smell them. However, a lot of the old lilacs have grown so big and tall and congested that the flowers are simply out of reach. So the first thing we want to do, if you have a lilac that is too tall and too congested, again, go to the ground, look at the stems, pick out the oldest 1, 2, 3, up to 1/3 of those canes. Remove them as low to the ground as you can, and then look at the remaining shrub. Choose some of the remaining canes to shorten them to side shoots. Keep in mind, the best flowers come from pencil-sized stems. So it's a good idea to keep your plant pruned in a way to stimulate new growth, so you will have the best flowers and also somewhat more within reach. Rhododendron and azalea really should not be pruned much at all. They might be they might be shaped right after bloom. Deadheading is a good idea. Remove the spent flowers so the plant does not waste any energy going towards seeds. And keep in mind that sometimes, especially rhododendron, can become really leggy because they're growing in so much shade, and the lack of light force them to reach for the light. So if those plants have rough bark, remember they will respond to hard pruning by having latent buds appear below the cut. So you can be a little harsher than you think otherwise. Hardy fuchsia. They bloom on new growth coming from the current year. So if you do not mind the fuchsia during the fall and winter looking a little messy, you can wait until the spring and notice when the new growth begin and cut to the new growth for the current season. But if you can't stand the messy look, you can simply cut them back to 2-3 feet in the fall, so you have less throughout the winter season, but you're gonna have to go back probably in the spring to make a little more pruning to clean it up. So finally, I want to say something about hedge and topiaries. It's not as popular as in other parts of the world, but we do see hedge and topiaries in our area. The important thing in keeping them healthy is the illustration in the lower right-hand corner. So the correct way to shape them is to make sure that the bottom of your hedge is exposed to sunlight, because without sunlight, we're not going to have good growth and it will not look good. And this is a picture from my neighborhood. And would you believe the picture on the right, where the plant has splayed out and looking like quite a mess from the ice damage is just the other half of the same plants as shown in the picture on the left. So these are the two sides of the same plant. And after the ice damage, the homeowner on one side decided to shorten the branches, tie some of them back, and remove the ones that are lower because they were beyond salvation, and end up with a picture that's neater looking. And then they're just going to grow tall shrubs in front to hide the naked legs. And the owner of the hedge, the other half of the hedge, had not done anything, and this is what you see. So again, I think this is an illustration of things that gardeners can do and where our limits are. So if you use boxwood for hedges, just know that there is a new disease in town, and it's called boxwood blight. It creates lesion like the picture in the lower left-hand corner. In the foliage, in the stems, it'll cause the leaves to drop. And it's been in Oregon for a few years now, and Oregon State University has some information on that. The simplest thing that homeowners can do, in addition to being vigilant and keep an eye out and look for problems, is to prune your boxwood in the summer when our weather is dry. Because again, pruning creates a wound. Wound is an entry for infestation, and pruning in July, August during our dry season is going to minimize the risk of injury. So I've covered a lot of things in very little time, and I'm sure you will have questions about how to prune your trees and shrub. So here are some resources. Oregon State University has many free publications at this website. Tammany University also have a lot of resources, videos, and handouts at the Seamaster Gardeners website. And finally, the Master Gardener helpline at metromastergardeners.org are available to help with any questions. So please give us a try, and happy pruning.